Welcome, everyone. My name is Rand Wentworth, and I teach environmental politics at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm also the leader of the Bacon Environmental Fellows at the Center for Public Leadership. In just 2 weeks, representatives from over 190 countries will gather in Scotland to negotiate a global plan of action to fight climate change. Nations agree that there is a big problem out there, but they have very different views on how to move forward. When I teach negotiation, I encourage my students to look for the interests behind the positions of various counterparts. And indeed, empathy, I believe, the ability to walk in the shoes of another, to understand the interests of another, is, I think, the most important skill of negotiation. So in this series, we'll strive to understand the underlying interests of the various nations negotiating at Glasgow. As we've talked in past weeks, China, for example, is both building and shutting down coal plants. The lack of electricity threatens to cripple the economy. And at the same time, a growing middle class is demanding action to reduce air pollution in their backyards from coal plants. So conflicting interests bring China different positions as they come to Glasgow. Today, we will look at the climate policies of the United Arab Emirates and gain some insights into the interests of other oil-producing countries. On October 1, just a couple of weeks ago, the UAE really astonished the world, I think, in announcing a plan to be net zero by 2050, and that they would invest 163 billion in renewable energy. The UAE is the first country in the Middle East and North Africa to make this commitment. This workshop series is co-sponsored by Gabrielle and Louis Bacon and the Environmental Fellows at the Center for Public Leadership, also the Belfer Center's Environment and Natural Resources Program, and CPIC. The format for today will be a moderated discussion for the first 30 minutes, followed by student questions. We'll wrap up at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. You can either put questions in the chat or we'll use the raise hand function, but please wait until we get to the open dialogue to raise your hand. Today, I'm just delighted that my co-moderator is Anisse Terai. He is a mid-career MPA candidate, and at the Center for Public Leadership, he's an Emirates Leadership Initiative Fellow here at the Kennedy School. Coming to the Kennedy School, Anisse worked as a development banker, investment professional, an energy specialist. He is the founding managing director of ISEF, a fund dedicated to energy security in developing nations. Anisse has been a professor, a columnist, and he is listed as one of the top 100 African future economic leaders. Anisse, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for the generous introduction, Rand. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to receive Tina today. Tina is one of the lead negotiators for the Paris Climate Agreement, and she currently serves as the head of international affairs to the UAE Special Envoy for climate change. Her work focuses on shifting the narrative on climate change, transforming it from an ideological and altruistic issue to one that delivers jobs, economic growth, and business opportunities. Her work focuses also on different spectrums of climate and negotiation. Originally, she's from Melbourne, Australia. She began her career as banking and finance lawyer at a leading Australian firm, and she is also a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School. So welcome home, Tina.
Thank you, Anisse. Thank you, Professor Wentworth.
Well, Tina, let's start there. You're a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. I know that the students who are participating in this online dialogue would be curious about your life and your career. Where did you grow up, and how did you come to be active in climate negotiations?
Well, thank you so much, Rand. It's such a pleasure to see everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be connected back into the HKS community. Just want to say congratulations as well to all the students that have joined. I met some of you, including Anisse, during the mid-career program. We did a little bit of work on climate change. And I'm just so happy that you're all joining now in person in Cambridge and are getting to experience the wonders of the Harvard campus, as fun as Zoom is. So I'm so sorry for objecting you to some more online online sessions, but you're really in for an incredibly fantastic experience and year. And thank you, Rand. Thank you for the question. It's a very nice opening, and in some ways, actually, I think my answer will echo what you said and what you teach around empathy and understanding the other. So to tell you about myself, as Anisse said, I'm originally from Melbourne, Australia, but my parents are of Lebanese and Syrian origin. They both immigrated with their families to Melbourne back in the 1970s during the civil war in Lebanon. And I think, without being overly reductive, I think that their legacy and their background established an interest for me and a connection to the Middle East and activated a broader awareness of the world outside of Australia. But I think there's another dimension too, which hooks into my career. And I think depending on who you ask, people would either describe me as a true blue Melburnian who loves flat whites and Aesop hand soap, which might be overpriced, but is still very excellent. Or others might describe me as an Arab female expat who lives overseas. And I think that sense of the other has been formative, and it's given me flexibility in how I see myself and also how I see others. And so, Rand, I noticed this impact when I started working in climate, and certainly when I was helping negotiate the Paris Agreement. You know, I could come in and join a text negotiation or an initial meeting to explore bilateral opportunities and very quickly understand the boxes that needed to be ticked for each party and, you know, how those boxes needed to be ticked. You know, a lot of my job is, in fact, packaging, you know, international requests for partnerships and the reverse in a way that works for sort of all sides, both the UAE and our partners. And my time in the multilateral sphere has really underscored that there are approaches and messages that have better odds of yielding results in, say, you know, whether I'm dealing with Australia or if I'm dealing with Fiji. And so in addition to that, Rand, which I think is very much aligned in the wonderful work that you teach and that you do, you know, another thing that really draws me to climate is my belief that overcoming it requires action by all, whether you're a wealthy, industrialized country, or if you're, you know, a small island state that is facing what can only be described as, you know, an existential threat. So when it comes to overcoming climate change, you know, none of us is safe until all of us are safe. But no, that's my story. And I will say, just to land back on the HKS thing, because it is wonderful to be back. I will say that, you know, one thing that I really loved about the Kennedy School was that someone like me wasn't really an anomaly. And in fact, it's that kind of diversity is normal, which I loved so much about my time there. And so, you know, being an Australian, Muslim, Arab, expat, female, amongst other identifiers, you know, showing me repeatedly that there is value to having people in public service who can see the problem and the solution from the perspective of multiple constituencies without condescending to any of them. So I'm sure a lot of people in this audience today can empathize with that. And it's a really wonderful place to be, to explore what that really means and what it can lead to.
Well, Tina, thank you. Now that we know you, let's jump in. Anisse?
Yes. So Tina, what was it like to be a negotiator at the Paris Agreement? What were the biggest accomplishments, and where did you think that the agreement and negotiations fall short of expectations?
Thanks, Anisse. Negotiating Paris was, I mean, just such a phenomenal and privileged experience that I was able to have. And there's a lot to say, but I will try and keep it short. because I know we only have a limited amount of time here today, but the critical thing I think for many people to realize about Paris is that it was always meant to just be a starting point. You know, Paris was never going to be the end. And what Paris did do, and what we did do, you know, in 2015, was really lay the groundwork for a global architecture, which will hopefully put us on a path to 2, or most ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what scientists tell us is needed to avert the worst impacts of global warming. And the key really to Paris and to what we achieved, which was, you know, pretty phenomenal, is that it committed every country, regardless of whether you were developed or developing, poor or wealthy, to put forward pledges. Now, these pledges are technically known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and they're due every 5 years. Now, these pledges are meant to map out what each country is going to do to both reduce their emissions and also adapt to the impacts of climate change. And the key behind it all really is that each of these submissions are meant to be more ambitious than the last. So you have this like ratchet up mechanism, and the hope is that by 2050, we'll get to a situation where the world has collectively, you know, reached net zero emissions. And so I think, you know, we talk about where did Paris fall short. You know, I think the crucial thing to understand about Paris is it's built on, you know, how can I describe it? It's built on like what is almost like a peer pressure system. So, you know, countries are expected to step up, and, you know, the idea, perhaps we were being naive, is that, you know, each country would outcompete to out-deliver each other within each of their pledges. And so I think that really rested on a belief that the world would continue to believe in the integrity and the importance of multilateral systems and global governance, which, suffice to say, you know, has taken a hit in the last 5 years. But you query, is that the failure of Paris, or the failure of you know, global systems? And I mean, I would argue that the Paris Agreement's flexibility has meant that, despite, you know, in the last you know, 4 years or 5 years, despite the rise in nationalism and skepticism around multilateral systems, the Paris Agreement still very much is alive, and it's still very much the concern of global leaders. But there's a long way to go, and I think everyone has their eyes on Glasgow, which I think is now 12 days away, or 13 days away.
Let's switch then to Glasgow. Due to the pandemic, there's a backlog. The COP was postponed. There's a lot of issues have been waiting for personal negotiation. Why do you think Glasgow, this meeting in just 2 weeks, why is it so important? And what do you think the big issues are that need to be negotiated and resolved at this meeting?
Yeah, Glasgow is quite a big deal. Some people are dubbing it the most important meeting since Paris, and a large part of that is because it's the first time in that 5-year cycle when the new NGOs, or these new pledges, are due. And so, of course, COP26 was postponed from last year due to the global pandemic. And so in 2 weeks, or just under 2 weeks, it'll be the first time that I'm meeting my global counterparts face to face for the first time in 2 years. And there is an immense backlog of issues. And so let me break down to you what I think, you know, in terms of what success looks like and why this is really important. I see two things, or two sort of buckets, in which governments, and certainly I'm going into Glasgow and looking at how and defining success by. So first I think is closing out some of the technical issues and what's known as the Paris rulebook. So there are a number of outstanding issues relating to the Paris Agreement and how it's going to be governed. Things like transparency, reporting, verification of targets, etc. And there's also a really big issue around what's known as Article 6, which is essentially the provision in the Paris Agreement that's meant to create new carbon markets where countries can buy offsets and, towards meeting their various pledges. So each of these issues needs to be resolved. Now, normally in a pre-COVID world, countries would have met a number of times during the year, including in what's known as an intersessional climate session, which normally happens in June in Bonn. And in these meetings, the negotiators can sort of close out text, they can remove square brackets, and then you go into the COP quite confident that you can reach a decision on, the biggest, most substantive issue. So we haven't been able to do this. Our meetings have been virtual, and because of that, we haven't been able to take any legal decisions. And that does put pressure on the negotiators going into Glasgow. But I believe that we will be able to close out these issues. It's our job to do so, and if we don't, then frankly, shame on us, because this work is truly crucial to the integrity of the agreement and to the integrity of the convention itself. Now, the second thing, which I'm looking at, and what I think countries are looking at in terms of determining the success, is the political successes. And so, for me, I think it's a very interesting time to be in the climate world, especially as a diplomat. I think from a government perspective, if I can take us back to 2015, when we were negotiating Paris, the type of political pressure we would be facing as diplomats and as governments was whether or not we would block an agreement, or whether we were going to, allow for countries to agree to a legally binding agreement in Paris. And that's what, President Obama, what Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, what Laurent Fabius, the president of COP21, would be on the phone to your principals about. It was about making sure that we get everyone in the room and getting ready to agree to the framework and to the Paris Agreement, which we did and which was successful. But today, the political pressure is really around, will you make a net zero announcement? And connected to that is the examination of the short-term targets, making sure that your 2030 goals are really aligned with the trajectory of net zero. And I think that represents, at least to me, what I think is one of the most important things that's happening within the global climate dialogue now, and what makes me most optimistic for the agreement. And that's the reframe of climate action as an opportunity, particularly as an economic opportunity. Paris aims to get us to net zero emissions by 2050. And we know we need to move urgently towards this path in order to stop, the heat waves, the hurricanes, the fires and droughts that are happening every year. But there's also this positive case for action, and one that recognizes that the Paris Agreement is really a call for structural change to the global economy. And that's what we're seeing around the world. And I'm incredibly excited about that. From a small share, I think in 2018, we now have reached a situation where over 80% of the world economy is under net zero pledges. And what all of this means is there'll be this wave of investment and innovation like the world has never seen before. And there are going to be winners who act early and losers who, try and ignore the structural change that is upon us. So I very much hope that your next question will be about the UAE's own net zero target, which we announced, as you said, earlier this month, and which we're incredibly excited and proud to have made.
Absolutely. So first, congratulations to the UAE commitment to achieve net zero. So let's take a closer look at net zero. What does it really mean? And is it a credible target to build momentum?
Absolutely. We were really excited about the net zero strategic initiative that was announced by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed earlier this month during the opening of the World Expo, which is also, I will plug in, happening right now, and a wonderful reason to visit the UAE. But I think what's most exciting to me, not only as a person who works within the UAE ecosystem, but generally as someone within the broader global climate framework, is that the net zero strategic initiative that's been announced by the UAE really aligns with the development path that the country's already on towards diversifying its economy. So what I think the approach here has been it's not just about looking at an emissions reductions exercise, it's also looking about an economic development plan. So what we're hoping to do is really use this opportunity to develop new industries, new skills, new jobs. And so I think that's really exciting. I think that's really sort of sustainable and what will lead to sort of systemic changes when net zero on climate action is viewed really as an economic planning exercise. I was reading just a few hours ago, someone sent to me the UK's net zero strategy and roadmap, which was released just this afternoon. And I'm always very amused. One of my favorite climate speakers this year has been Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I know his speechwriter, and I always find it amusing to listen to Prime Minister Johnson and understand, what was written and what's just off the cuff. But Boris Johnson's forward in the what's called, I think it's called the Build Back Greener strategy. If you Google it today, his forward was really interesting because in no uncertain terms, he made it very clear that net zero, bold climate action is really a means to better jobs, to better growth, and to more prosperity for all. So I think that's what's most exciting here. And I think that's what we're really working towards across all of ministries and across the whole of government.
Well, Tina, the UAE announcement to net zero is in a way proof that the Paris framework is working. Countries are coming up, challenging each other to do better. And my hat's off to the UAE for doing that. You are in the UAE right now. I think it's 8:30 your time. But early this morning, the UAE made yet another big announcement. Would you tell us about that and tell us a little bit about why this was so important for the government?
Thanks, Rand. I think you're talking about was a kind of announcement. So we've been working for the last year with our colleagues within the UNFCCC process. We put in an offer to host the 2023 climate conference, COP28, which will happen. And so there was a big process internally speaking to our fellow members within the Asia Pacific group. These COPs are normally hosted according to regional groupings, and we were quite happy this morning to have reached what we think is now consensus within our partners and support from many of our major partners. And we're looking hopefully to formally affirm that we will be the host of COP28 in 2023. I'm a lawyer by background, as Anisse said, so there are many different decisions and procedures that need to go on, but we're quite excited to have had the support of the group, and it puts us in a really good position to confirm that. And I think that's incredibly exciting. It's incredibly exciting because of the narrative that I've been sort of talking about here. And I think the UAE has significant influence, not only in the region, but, I think as a major oil and gas producer, who is a leader in renewable energy, who is, putting its money where its mouth is. Sorry, I was losing my diplomatic terms, so I revert to my Australian colloquialisms. But I think it's really exciting. We're a proven convener on the issue of climate change. And I think we're going to really be able to push for bolder climate action through our offer to host COP28. So we're very, very excited about that. And hopefully we can continue working, I think, with the Kennedy School students as well, to hopefully, get you guys more involved and more engaged in the process.
Certainly. We are receiving some very interesting questions in the chat. So please bear with us. We will get back to you. Tina, there has been an astonishing decline in the cost of renewable energy. In some projects, it dropped to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. What will happen in the UAE and other oil-producing countries when the solar gets even cheaper?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really great question, because right now in the UAE and in many parts of the world, solar is actually cheaper than conventional energy. And so indeed, that is precisely what's pushed our very ambitious climate targets. And I'll say, you know, it's not just the action we're taking domestically and the work we're doing domestically, even from an investment perspective. You know, the UAE, and we're not alone in this, but, you know, we're making investments internationally that make commercial sense all around the world. So I think, for instance, we've had massive investments in wind projects that have helped the UK become a global leader in wind power generation. We've invested in startup solar projects, I think, in over 27 Pacific Island nations. And just earlier this year, we signed a milestone agreement to bring wind and solar energy to Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan. So I just, you know, I say this in the sense of you're not asking a hypothetical. It's a reality, and I think again comes back into the narrative of climate action really being a means to an end, and that end is just building back better. It's more jobs, it's better infrastructure, it's a safer planet for all of us.
Well, Tina, the UAE clearly is exercising leadership. Could you give us some transferable examples, actions that other countries might take? And you know, speaking as a citizen of the United States, we like to think we're global leaders in climate change, but we're stumbling a bit right now. Might there be even something that the United States could learn from the UAE?
I think the US is doing pretty well under President Biden. I was lucky enough to work on the campaign. Big fan of Gina McCarthy, who Anisse would know was one of the speakers in the summer program. And so you might be stumbling, but you're in incredibly good hands. And I think actually one of the transferable examples that I would think about for the UAE that I think is also something we're seeing in the US is really, again, around viewing climate change and climate action as a means to an end rather than end itself. So when you shift the narrative and you see climate action as an opportunity to create better jobs, to improve environmental justice, to improve air quality, to improve health, etc., I think that's when you really are able to make the big structural and permanent changes that you need. I mean, President Biden has said that every policy is now going to be a climate policy, whether it's domestic or international. And if you notice the way, you know, the administration speaks about climate, it's very much entrenched in this idea of jobs and infrastructure and the grandness of the American manufacturing, revolution, etc. And that narrative, I think, is much more difficult to unpick, even if you moved into a more conservative government later on. I think that narrative is harder to unpick rather than one that's purely about climate action per se. But I think one of the things as well in the UAE, and it takes me to an anecdote of when I was back in Melbourne. I used to work for quite a large law firm back in Melbourne. When I told my partner, who was the head of the banking and finance practice, that I was accepting a job in the UAE to help lead the Paris climate negotiations, he was like, "What? Like, you're going to an oil-producing country to work on climate change? This makes no sense." So this was back in 2013 when, God bless him, Tony Abbott had just been elected as Australian Prime Minister and had begun disassembling, the various departments of climate change and science, etc. And so I was like, well, what is happening back here? And so for me, going from my home country to a country like the UAE, which does seem like an unlikely actor within the climate field, the vision here has been so wonderful, including not only in terms of the economic opportunity, but also in terms of the diplomatic opportunities and the opportunities to exercise your soft power through climate action. I think the UAE's done a tremendous job of mobilizing, for instance, its foreign aid towards renewable energy projects and clean technology projects. within fellow developing countries. I think the amount we spend on various climate facilities exceeds $1 billion. And that really has just allowed for so many opportunities for new partnerships and really developing friendships with countries all over the world. So I think it's the idea, if I could land it, it's the idea of using climate action as a tool for greater prosperity and looking at the opportunity, especially because so much of the time the conversation around climate is very heavy and it seems bleak, right? And I'm not trying to sugarcoat things. It is an immense challenge, but there is a silver lining, which I'm happy to see most politicians now moving forward with.
Speaking of which,
Lisa, I'm going to ask you to do the last question, but before we do that, this is the time we'll be looking at questions from students and participants. You can either put your question in the chat or use the raise hand function. So, Anisse.
Yeah, actually, I was going to build on Bill Hauser question in the chat, which I find very relevant. And basically, Bill is asking how would the US arrival in Glasgow without meaningful US domestic budgetary commitments to, to the famous 100 billion climate funding look like? And do you think that the UAE, for instance, could influence the US or kind of inspire the US to put, the check on the table?
It's a really pertinent question. One of the things that I, could fall into either the technical, what does success look like was the earlier question. So it could fall into either the technical camp or the political camp. One of the real overarching issues going into Glasgow is the issue of the $100 billion that was pledged in Copenhagen by President Obama and other world leaders. And we're seen as sort of the one silver lining of what was otherwise, failed negotiations. That 100 billion was due in 2020 and still hasn't been delivered. There's, without getting into the politics and the dynamics of this, but within the climate negotiations, there's a very clear bifurcation between developed and developing countries, and so the UAE is not sort of a part of the group of countries that would make up the $100 billion contribution. But as I said earlier, we do have immense leadership within the area of climate aid. But I think I would say, just from being in the negotiations, this is one of the issues that comes up quite regularly. There's a G20 meeting happening at the end of the month. This is very much going to be on the agenda. Countries have been coming forward with greater contributions, but Bill, I think this is a question that many leaders would have, and I think many people will be watching the G20 towards the end of the month to not only see leaders reaffirm their commitment to meeting the $100 billion pledge, but as you say, to really detail what those monetary figures are and when they'll be allocated.
Now this is your opportunity to ask questions to Tina, as is the practice here at the Harvard Kennedy School. The question is brief and it ends with a question mark. We welcome your thoughts now.
Maybe we can build on Gwen's comment earlier. In fact, she was asking if there are any international mechanisms to pressurize multinational oil companies in basically reducing flaring, or in fact just stopping gas flaring and other types of emissions in their operations.
Yeah, there are many international mechanisms. There was a huge initiative that was just launched by the US and the EU, actually, and had a really wonderful write-up in the New York Times around methane and gas flaring. And I think that's something that's going to be pushed forward. But I think more generally, I think, as we move into a more carbon constrained world, one of the things that is going to be most important is to look at the efficiency even of the hydrocarbon fossil fuel sector. So I think that by default, and given the way that we're moving globally, this is something that that all companies, including oil companies, are going to have to look at. You know, how do you make hydrocarbons as least carbon intensive as possible through the process?
I see a raised hand from Jed Schwartz. Would you just tell us a little bit about your background and then ask your question?
Yeah, I'm an unaffiliated writer. I've been concerned about the climate since the 7th grade. And I have a B degree and dropped out of graduate school at UMass Amherst. My question is, yeah. I'm reading a book by Nicholas Jepson, which emphasizes the importance of energy exports to the third world, and for their ability to forgive debt. And the question is, have you got any ideas about how if we shift away from fossil fuels, how that mechanism for attaining wealth in the third world could be accounted for?
Thanks, Jed. Very nice.
Yeah.
So it's very nice to meet you. It's very, very important, very big question. One of the things as well that's really important around, I touched on it a little earlier, but the Article 6 negotiations around carbon markets. The carbon markets mechanism follows on what was established in the Kyoto Protocol, where the Kyoto Protocol had developed the clean development mechanism. And what was really exciting about the clean development mechanism is that it provided an opportunity for developing countries to raise funds by creating credits for renewable energy projects, therefore allowing them to lift themselves out of poverty and electrify their own countries by creating these projects and investing in them, and creating credits that would then be sold to developed countries that could use those offsets to meet their own commitments. There are a ton of negotiations, conversations, and principles that are enshrined within the UNFCCC, so the convention that oversees the Paris Agreement, that seek to protect developing countries, but also to allow them the assistance that's needed to continue to succeed and to continue to develop within a carbon-constrained economy. So there are a lot of mechanisms in there around technology transfer, around capacity building, and I think moving into Glasgow, I think the Article 6 negotiations are going to be watched very closely, because they are very much seen as an opportunity for developing countries to create revenue by investing in clean technology that would otherwise replace, what would otherwise be, conventional energy. So it's a good question.
Gwen Spieth made an interesting question in the chat. Gwen, would you like to ask the question yourself, or would you like me to read it?
Hi, yeah, Anisse mentioned, asked part of it, but yeah, I've just been listening to scientists talking about their research about unused wells. I mean, historical resources, historical oil and gas wells that are dotted all over America, and presumably other countries as well, setting aside active facilities that are producing things now, where there's these flaring, as you mentioned, and just leaks, which are just wasting a resource that we should be treating as more precious, even as we move away from it. But it seems crazy that you could immediately take all this methane off the table by just doing this mitigation, and there's even some profit to be recuperated. Why don't we do that? It's driving me crazy. It seems so simple, like low-hanging fruit, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. Methane is such a big, so just to keep it as simple as possible. So methane is a polluter is so much more potent than carbon dioxide, and therefore there is a lot of attention increasingly on methane emissions, particularly within the oil and gas industry. I think, as I said before, and Anisse did ask parts of that question, so there are certainly mechanisms that are looking at that. But what's really interesting as well is that there is just so much technology, particularly around now that we've come into the fourth industrial revolution, as they say. There are a lot of companies that are utilizing, things like artificial intelligence, things like satellites, things like better monitoring and real-time data to sort of better identify these leaks and be able to sort of fix them. Not only because of international pressure, but because, Gwen, as you said, because it saves money and generates more revenue. So I think it's absolutely a pertinent question. I think I would also just say generally, just to zoom back, I think the questions that you're asking, Gwen, and these kinds of conversations are only going to become more pertinent as we move into a world, after Glasgow. We were all looking at Glasgow. I was talking to someone yesterday. Glasgow is really important, but what happens after Glasgow is almost more important than that. We're going to hopefully get the world to, over 80 plus, we're hopefully going to get to a situation where over 90% of the world's economy is under net zero commitments. That may be the target that we reach in Glasgow. What next? How do we get there? What are the technologies that are needed to, if they don't exist, to exist? If they do exist but haven't been commercialized, to get commercialized. So I think it'll be really interesting next year. And I think this is one of the things that the UAE would look to do as COP28 president. How do we bring in this conversation and really shed light on the technologies that are available and needed, and to scale that up in a way that we can actually meet these targets that we're talking about politically.
Yeah, there was an interesting question from Stephen Johnson. Maybe Stephen would like to ask it directly.
Yes, I had to unmute.
Sure. Yes.
So, can you hear me?
We hear you.
All right. I lived in Annapolis, Maryland for 30 years, and now my wife and I are in Ames, Iowa. In Annapolis, we took our home completely off fossil fuels when the furnace started to give out, and we called different companies in, and one of them said, you could do geothermal. And it's expensive, but there are incentives. So we did that, and when we were done, our house was entirely off fossil fuels. The heating system, the cooling system, the hot water system, the cooking, all that. We are now in Iowa in a house with a gas furnace, gas hot water heater, and we want to make the same move, but we have the means to do so. These are expensive transitions for a homeowner, and there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of homeowners in this country who are going to look at a $15,000, $20,000 price tag for getting your home off fossil fuels as insuperably high, and they're going to look at the benefit as somewhat low. And so it was occurring to me, what if the ownership of all the furnaces in the nation's homes and stores and offices were transferred to the electric sector? If the electric sector owned my furnace, and it was responsible for changing out my furnace, then I would get a better heating system, and I would get a little bit of savings, but I wouldn't be the one facing the capital cost. I think if we put the capital cost of getting all our homes off fossil fuels on American homeowners, we'll never succeed. If we can figure out how to get the capital cost off the shoulders of homeowners.
Excuse me, Stephen.
Yep.
Our guidelines is the question is brief and it ends with a question mark. So I understand the concern about domestic hot water furnaces, but it's a little far afield to ask our ambassador from the UAE. Tina, do you have any
Oh,
reflections or thoughts?
It's
Stephen,
a what do you think question.
no, absolutely. Stephen, I'll tell you, I think your point is really pertinent and fits into the, to the themes that we were talking about. Particularly, we didn't get into it, but I think the approach that the Biden administration is taking all across government. I think there's a really interesting program that they're starting up with the Department of Energy to give loans for the activities that you're talking about. But what I was going to say, I had a get out of jail free card, Rand. As I say, I know that your next speaker is Ali Zaidi, who is Gina McCarthy's deputy. And so I was going to say, please come back next time to the next one of these series and ask him that specific question, because I couldn't comment on the intricacies, but I will say that as an outside observer, I do know this is one of the priorities of the administration. So you'll have the opportunity to ask that next week to Ali, who I'm sure will have very detailed questions that I wouldn't be able to give right now. But I did say, Rand, sorry, I hope you don't mind. I was looking at a question that Ruby asked. And Bill, thank you for also sharing that very timely article from the Washington Post, particularly around satellites and what I was trying to discuss as well, around the importance of monitoring these leaks and leveraging technology for that. But Ruby's question was really interesting as well, around how do you incentivize a shift to renewable energy? And this is particularly in the context of developing countries. It's really interesting that, in the time that I've been in this field, and it hasn't been, that long, it's been 10 years, the discussion around renewables has shifted dramatically, and that's primarily due to the price drop and how cheap renewables are. And so that impacts the conversation as well, including from a development and an aid perspective. There was a really interesting article, and sorry to just divert you all back to news pieces, but there was a really interesting piece by Larry Fink that was in the New York Times last week. Larry Fink is the president of BlackRock, which is one of the largest asset managers. And he put out this article right before the IMF and the World Bank meetings, and essentially saying that we need to rejig and readjust the way that development banks work, and we need to understand how can you leverage public finance to mobilize private finance. So many of the risks associated with deploying capital in developing countries is associated to, the risk of forfeiture or the client defaulting, et cetera. But there are ways we can leverage public finance to bring in private capital and blend that in order to be able to deploy projects and deploy more capital. So I think that's something which I think you're going to be hearing a lot more of as we move forward, and to see the institutional investors come together with the development banks and have these conversations, to me is really quite wonderful, because it's not something that you would have imagined 5-10 years ago. But I think there's a lot to be done there, particularly because renewables now are cost effective and don't need concessional finance. They can actually be benefit from private capital and commercial capital too.
Tina, the UAE announcement and the announcement from corporations all over the world to be net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. So we talked about this being potentially a powerful driver to fight climate change. But the UAE is not soon going to stop drilling oil, and corporations are not soon going to stop emitting carbon and greenhouse gases. So they get to net zero using offsets, the purchase of offsets. The most verifiable offset is carbon capture and storage, but it's extremely expensive. Other offsets have less credibility, and I'm just curious if so much of the international action around addressing climate change depends on offsets. It seems that there's a lot of weak thinking, weak science behind these offsets. And it's lots about how we might create an international protocol.
That's a really important question, Rand. I think this is one of the things that's going to be discussed in Glasgow, certainly around the Article 6 negotiations. There's been offsets are a really tricky thing. And there was, if you follow the topic, a lot of controversy generated, particularly this year and last year, around tree planting, which I think when most people think about creating an offset. So I think the most common example that all of us would have come across is if you ever buy an airline ticket and it ticks, do you want to offset your emissions? And usually that's you'd imagine done through planting trees. But there's been a ton of controversy generated around the credibility and integrity of those activities, whether or not they actually are additional to existing projects, whether, what happens if the trees fall down or burn, or etc. What happens to those emissions? There's a ton of stuff, as you said, Rand, weak thinking, weak science. So it is absolutely crucial that we develop very, very robust, transparent, verifiable guidelines to measure and regulate these offsets. And so we're really hoping to get solutions around that in Glasgow. But I will say offsets are an important part of net zero. But from my thinking, and what I would hope is that thinking in most entities and corporations that are making these net zero announcements, the offsets come second, right? The first conversation has to be, how do you reduce your emissions? How do you eliminate emissions?
Yes.
For everything that you can't eliminate, for everything that you can't mitigate, then you have the offset conversation. And so I think that primarily has to be the focus. But that being said, they are going to play a part, and I would agree with you that there needs to be a lot of emphasis now around developing a credible guidelines around that.
Okay, I guess we are nearing the 1 hour. We know it's very late for you, Tina. So before we let you go, a lot of students at the Kennedy School are contemplating careers in the climate field. And we see that there is a lot to be done. So what would be your advices to them to get into the field and to basically be useful in fighting climate change?
Well, I was going to say, Anisse, everyone, you're already in the field. I mean, I think every job now, every career is a climate career, and it doesn't necessarily mean dedicating yourself to the climate cause per se. But I think in every industry, whether it's finance, whether it's government, whether it's health, whether it's defense, whether it's national security, every job is a climate job. This is the world that we are living in. So I think one of the things that we tried to do in the summer program was prompt everyone, no matter what sector they'd come in from, to just understand the basic mechanics of climate change, understand the basic mechanics of, net zero, of the Paris Agreement, of all these wonderful terms that I assume everyone in the world knows, but no one outside my immediate professional circle seems to recognize. But there is an obligation of understanding what each of these things means, and then understanding how do you communicate that urgency within your respective fields. I had wonderful conversations with someone who, has ended up being like one of my brothers and very close friends from the Kennedy School, who was in the national security field. And we had really tremendous conversations around how can you use climate action and gender empowerment to both address climate change, but also improve national security. The empowerment of women, there's a wonderful project called Project Drawdown, which lists the top 100 solutions to climate change. Women's empowerment is listed as the #1 solution. So the education of women and access to family planning. And then, empowering women has knock-on effects and improves gets us to the goals of Paris, but then also enhances and secures national security. So I think every job's a climate job. I think Harvard's doing a really wonderful job at trying to boost up the curriculum because it is such an important public policy matter. And I think failing all that, please do feel free to reach out to me at any point. It was such a privilege to be part of the Kennedy School community, and I love staying connected. But I think this is, it's a new world where we're living in, where I think climate change is really just going to be ingrained at all levels. So it's something that we all have a responsibility to understand how to act within our relative circles on.
Tina, you are an inspiration. I just feel so proud for the Harvard Kennedy School that one of its graduates is in the position you're in, making a difference in UAE and bridging from the negotiations in Paris now to Glasgow. That you're there, that you're steady and thoughtful, gives me hope that the nations of this earth could come together and step by step, halting steps often, make progress towards climate change. I just want to alert people that in the chat box, there are some terrific resources that people have contributed. There's one question about the role of India that we won't have time to address today, but I encourage you to go back at the Center for Public Leadership website. We have the recording of these past sessions, and we had Ambassador Puri addressed us just 2 weeks ago, and so you have a great insight from him on what India needs to be doing. I just want to close by reminding people that the next lecture in this series, the Road to Glasgow, will be live from the White House with Ali Zaidi. He is the Deputy Climate Advisor for President Biden. He works day in and day out with my friend and our former faculty member of Gina McCarthy. And that will be Wednesday, October 27th, next week at 5 p.m. and stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for your interest in climate change and for participating today.
Thank you, Tina, and all the best at Glasgow.
Thank you. See you all soon. Thank you so much.
See you. Thank you, and thanks for the audience, and Rand.
Thanks.